I have sat in examination halls for 40 years. I have heard prodigies and frauds, nervous wrecks and polished professionals, children who played as though the keyboard were a minefield and old men who played as though it were a prayer. After a certain point, you stop hearing the music and start hearing only the space between the notes. The hesitation, the covering maneuver, the moment a hand drops half a tone flat and the player hopes no one noticed. I noticed everything. That was the job. I was 74 years old and long retired when Aldrich Voss invited me back to the Dalmore Conservatory autumn examination as an observer, a courtesy extended to former senior examiners on their milestone birthdays. I had not asked to be there. But Aldrich was the kind of man who offered things that were not quite gifts, and I accepted in the spirit it was given, which is to say, I brought a thermos of strong tea and sat myself in the very back row where I could hear the acoustics as they actually were rather than as the room preferred to present them. The examination hall at Dalmore held 60 seats and a Steinway concert grand that was older than most of its examiners. The ceiling was vaulted, the walls paneled in oak gone dark with age, the whole room smelling faintly of rosin and old paper. I had sat in this specific chair third from the left, last row, at the examination of 23 students I could still name. Of those 23, perhaps 4 had gone on to careers I would call meaningful. Aldrich himself had been one of the others. There were 9 candidates that afternoon. Laura Sevick was last. I noticed her name on the program because her piece was listed incorrectly, or so I thought at first. Prokofiev Piano Sonata No. 7, third movement, precipitato. I looked at it twice. Then I looked at the panel table, where Aldrich sat between 2 younger colleagues I did not know, and I watched him read the same line and set down his pen with the particular deliberateness of a man who has just decided something. He leaned across to the examiner on his left and spoke quietly enough that I should not have heard it from the back row. The hall's acoustics, however, were honest to a fault. "She won't last 2 pages," he said. The other examiner made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but served the same purpose. The third did not look up. I opened my thermos. The first 8 candidates were what the afternoon had promised. 2 who were technically accomplished and emotionally absent, 1 who was emotionally present and technically insufficient, 3 who were both sufficient and forgettable, and 2 who were simply frightened. I made no notes. I was not there to evaluate. I drank my tea and I listened, and I thought about the piece waiting at the bottom of the program, and about the girl whose name was attached to it, and about what kind of teacher sends a 17-year-old into a room like this with the precipitato. There are pieces that are technically difficult. There are pieces that are technically brutal. And then there is the third movement of Prokofiev's 7th Sonata, which is in a category that might be called technically merciless. It runs at an insane tempo. The left hand works in steady thumping 7th chords like a machine that has forgotten how to stop, and over the top of it the right hand fires off an asymmetric melodic line that fights the rhythm at every turn, 5-beat phrases cutting across 4-beat bars, the whole structure designed to sound as though it is perpetually about to collapse without ever actually collapsing. It is the musical equivalent of a man running at full speed across ice. It demands a particular quality beyond mere technique, the ability to hold absolute inner stillness while the hands do something violent. Very few players under 30 have it. I had heard it played impeccably once in 40 years. The recording was famous. The pianist had been 41. Aldrich was not wrong about the technical reality. He was only wrong about the girl. Laura Sevick walked to the piano the way people walk when they are not thinking about walking. Not nervously, not with performance. She placed her music on the stand. She had brought the score, which some players do simply for comfort and others do because they genuinely need it, and she adjusted the bench with 2 small movements and she sat. She was slight. Dark hair pulled back without ceremony. A plain navy dress. She looked at the keys for a moment the way you look at something familiar before you begin. The panel did not look up. She put her hands on the keys and she began. The first bar landed in that room like a hand flat on a table. Not a pretty sound. The precipitato is not a pretty piece. It is a driven, clanging, asymmetric engine of a thing, and she hit the opening like she meant it, the left hand's thundering ostinato arriving with a weight that made the examiner to Aldrich's left actually flinch. Aldrich's pen was already still. The third examiner looked up. The second bar, the third, she did not slow. I sat forward in my chair. There is a moment in a truly good performance that has nothing to do with technical accuracy. It comes somewhere in the first 30 seconds, and it is simply the moment when you realize the player is not performing the music, they are inside it, and the music is happening through them, and the room is no longer the same room it was a moment ago. I had felt it perhaps 24 times in 40 years. It is not a comfortable feeling. It rearranges something. I felt it now. She played the opening page at a tempo that most advanced students would not attempt in practice, let alone in examination. Clean. The left hand implacable, the right hand threading its melody through the rhythmic cross-current without hesitation or apology. But it was not the tempo that was extraordinary. It was the quality I mentioned, the stillness. She was sitting perfectly still from the shoulders up. Her face was almost expressionless. And from that stillness, her hands were producing something that sounded like controlled fury, precise, purposeful, and entirely without fear. Aldrich had put his pen flat on the table. He was watching her hands. By the second page, the page she was not supposed to reach, the room had changed its arrangement entirely. The two younger examiners were both leaning slightly forward. The older of the two had folded her hands in front of her on the table, which I recognized as the posture of a person who has stopped evaluating and started listening. Two of the remaining audience members had shifted in their seats so that nothing was behind them but the music. I set down my thermos. I was watching her hands too now, and I was watching them the way I watch things when something is not adding up and I am trying to understand why. Because there is technique. And then there is the particular shape of technique. The way a hand approaches a chord, the degree of wrist rotation on a run, the precise moment a phrase is released rather than cut. These things are not accidents. They are taught, and the teaching leaves its mark as clearly as a signature if you have spent enough years reading signatures. I had spent 40 years reading them. The phrasing of the right hand in the middle section, the way she let the asymmetric line breathe for precisely one beat before pressing forward, creating a kind of internal pulse that was separate from and underneath the stated rhythm. That was not a young player's instinct. That was a specific thing, a learned thing. I had heard that particular breath, that exact placement in this building once before in a different era from a different player. A recital I had examined 22 years ago. I looked toward the back of the hall. She was standing against the far wall to my right, in the shadow past the last pillar, where the light from the high windows did not reach. I had not noticed her come in. She was perhaps 50, though life had written more in her face than most people's 50s. Plain coat, standing very still, watching the stage with an expression I could only describe as the look of someone releasing a held breath they had been holding for years. Her name was Cecile Mart. She had been a student at this conservatory 23 years ago, when I was a full examiner, and she was the most technically gifted pianist I had heard in a decade. She had been preparing the Prokofiev Seventh herself, preparing it with a patience and a ferocity that I remembered clearly. When the panel that year, chaired by someone other than Aldrich but not less certain of its prerogatives, had informed her that her scholarship would not be renewed. The reason given had been administrative. It was not administrative. She had been difficult, which in the vocabulary of that panel meant she had been inconvenient, too much her own player, too little interested in the direction they wanted to push her. She had left Dalmore and, as far as the formal record was concerned, left performance entirely. I had thought about her sometimes over the years, not often, but sometimes. Lara Sevic was now in the final section of the movement, and the hall was doing something I had only seen a room do twice before. It was holding its breath collectively, not performing attention, actually suspending it. Aldrich's hand had moved from the table to his knee. The younger examiner's folded hands had tightened. No one was writing. No one was moving. The Precipitato's final pages accelerate. They are designed to feel like something running out of time to finish. The left hand's ostinato hammering harder and harder, while the right hand's phrases grow more urgent, more compressed, until the last 16 bars arrive in a concentrated explosion that must be played at a tempo most students have never even attempted in isolation. At this tempo, with this piece, the margin for error is effectively zero. A single hesitation anywhere in those final bars and the whole structure collapses. There is no graceful recovery. There is only the wreckage. She did not hesitate. The final bars came through that room like something inevitable, not loud for its own sake, but precise in a way that made loud irrelevant. Each chord landed exactly where it had to land, and the right hand drove its last phrase through the rhythm's framework like a point being made that could not be unmade. And then there was the final chord, and the silence after it. The silence lasted longer than silences usually do. Then the younger examiner began to applaud. She was standing. The other younger examiner was half a second behind her, also standing. I was already on my feet, which surprised me. I had not decided to stand, I simply was. 4 of the 7 remaining audience members were standing. Aldrich was not. He stood last, alone among the panel. He stood slowly, the way a man stands when he is paying a debt he did not expect to be called on, and he applauded without expression, which was, I thought, the most honest thing I had seen him do. Lara Sevic sat with her hands in her lap for a moment. Then she looked up, and her eyes went not to the panel and not to the audience but to the back wall, to the shadow past the last pillar. It was empty. Cecil Mart was gone. I turned and I made my way along the back row and through the side door, but the corridor was already quiet. Whoever she had come to watch, she had watched. Whatever she had needed to see, she had seen it. She had trained this girl for 3 years. I understood now, 3 years of quiet mornings somewhere, in some room with an upright piano and a metronome, and a recording of the piece they had both refused to abandon. And she had sent her into the hall where it had once been taken from her, and she had stood in the back and heard it given back. I stood in the corridor for a moment. I thought about 40 years of examinations, of the pieces I had heard played and the pieces I had watched people give up, and I thought about what it takes to spend 3 years teaching someone a piece you never got to finish yourself, and to do it quietly, without acknowledgement, without any promise that the room would hear what you heard. Then I went back inside. The applause had not yet entirely died. Lara Sevic was still at the piano. She was looking at the keys the way you look at something after it has given you everything it had. The chairman's expression had not changed, but he was still standing, and that, in a room like that one, in a panel like that one, meant something that no written record would ever adequately capture. I have sat in examination halls for 40 years. I have heard the music and the space between the notes, the hesitation and the covering maneuver, the hands that tried and the hands that knew. I had never until that afternoon heard a piece played as though it belonged to 2 people, the one at the piano and the one who would never sit there again. But now I had heard it, and I understood something I should have understood 22 years ago, which is that certain gifts do not disappear when you refuse to recognize them. They find another way through. The girl had found hers. And somewhere in the city outside this building, a woman in a plain coat was walking home, having heard, at last, the piece finished.